Hello everyone, today we conclude our mini-series / introduction about British warfare during the 7 Years' War. In the last episode and essentially the half of the series, we've seen the Northern American theater, also the Mediterranean one. Today we talk about the West African, the Caribbean, also more specifically Cuban siege of Havana 1762, but we will see now, and especially the Indian campaign during the entire war 1756-1763, actually beyond, because as we've seen also in North America, things were to an extent activated earlier, with the French and Indian War starting 1754. Here it's similar because, as you know, the 7 Years' War it's not literally quite exactly the first war that was fought in all continents, but definitely the one that by scale could look like that. It's also, and that's why we're talking British warfare, by the way, the moment, in fact, of full European takeover through the British that become the largest power in the world, the strongest force out there, surpassing the Chinese, that historically, in absolute terms at least, they were more powerful, not than some Europeans, obviously, already. So here we're talking Plassey and so on, the Black Hole of Calcutta not only. And so the relation of the Englishman with this broader picture, that is a moment of enormous, in fact, foundational meaning for modern and contemporary history. We explained also in the previous episode. You can find everything in the topics comment down below, the entire context, and how, of course, this war could go different. At this point, we may have been speaking, we may have had in a parallel universe, of course, things would have not gone that way because everything would have changed radically. But you would have had the Schwerpunkt spoken in French, all right, rather than English. Plassey is a seminal moment, but there is much that could have happened, in fact, in different theaters. There is a striking French failure in the 7 Years' War that we partially discussed, if anything, for also the reforms that followed of the French Royal Army after this war. We talked also a bit about the U.S. War of Independence, etc. We'll talk more about 18th century warfare, especially the later one that is increasingly important in paving the way, in fact, to Napoleonic era, etc. But going back to the subject matter, in 1758, William Pitt, the brilliant strategist who was steering Britain's fortunes during the 7 Years' War, set out to cripple France not only on the battlefields of Europe, but also by severing the vital arteries of its colonial trade. Right, among the most promising targets were the French outposts strung along the coast of West Africa, which functioned as crucial hubs for the transatlantic slave trade and for the export of gum arabic, a commodity that had become indispensable to Europe's rapidly expanding textile industries, particularly in Britain, that was basically witnessing the ushering in of a veritable industrial revolution. And it, because of its role also in dyes and finishes, etc. So these outposts of the French in West Africa were centered on Saint Louis, a fortified trading settlement located at the mouth of the Senegal River, and on the island fortress of Gorée. For years, they had been a constant source of irritation to the Royal African Company, the chartered British monopoly that held sway over the slave trade from the Gambia River all the way to the Gold Coast. French corsairs and merchants who operated from these bases routinely raided British ships, snarled the supply lines that kept the trade flowing, and flooded European markets with goods sold at undercut prices. To eliminate this persistent threat once and for all, Pitt authorized a series of lean, precisely targeted expeditions. So as always, there is a formidable political guidance for a striking strategic success. Now, the first of these military expeditions was planned with the crucial assistance of Thomas Cumming, a resourceful American trader whose extensive travels through Senegambia had given him an intimate understanding of the region's tribal alliances, its treacherous riverine hazards, and the deep-seated local resentments against French taxes and monopolies. Cumming's proposal was straightforward yet bold, a lightning-fast amphibious assault on Saint-Louis, supported by alliances with African rulers who were eager to throw off the yoke of French exactions in exchange for better terms, at least under British influence. The small task force set sail from Plymouth in March 1758 under the command of Captain Harry Marsh. It consisted of 200 redcoats, mostly tough Irish recruits who had been drawn from garrisons across the Irish Sea, and was carried aboard 2 sloops of war, HMS Portsmouth and HMS Firedrake. After a brief stop at Tenerife to take on fresh water, limes steward of scurvy, and barrels of hardtack, the flotilla reached the treacherous bar at the mouth of the Senegal River in late April. Navigating the shifting sands there required the utmost caution, but once across, Cumming went ashore ahead of the main force. He quickly opened negotiations with the Damel of Cayor and the Brac of Valo, the local tribes, in return for muskets, bowls of cloth, and promises of preferential trading rights. With that, there was, of course, a ferocious competition between, sort of, at this point, the pro-French and pro-British tribes as well in the hinterland. These pro-British rulers pledged 500 warriors to form a pincer blockade that would prevent any French reinforcements from reaching Saint Louis from the interior. So the British attack amphibiously the Africans from the hinterland. This was quite advantageous because, as we've seen, both knew their respective deal, and they could, in this sense, seal off properly Saint Louis that was, in this sense, bottled by within its own natural defenses, cleverly exploited by those who knew how to. In fact, on the morning of April the 23rd, Marsh's troops splashed ashore south of the fort in the blinding tropical heat. Their scarlet uniforms stood out starkly against the white dunes as they snapped into disciplined lines, muskets shouldered and bayonets fixed. The French commander, Pierre Barthelot de Saint-Hilaire, could muster only 80 European soldiers and 90 African levies, and many of the latter melted away like chaff in the wind in the moment they caught sight of the Union Jack fluttering in the breeze. A tense parley followed, during which Barthelot sought guarantees for the safety of his men. Marsh, in a gesture of magnanimity, granted full honors of war to the French garrisons. By noon on May the 1st, the fleur-de-lis was lowered from the flagstaff. French drums rolled as the garrison filled out with colors cased and muskets reversed, and not a single British life had been lost in the entire operation. Remarkably enough, the 32 resident French traders knelt in submission and swore allegiance to King George II. Naturally, some embellishment would have occurred. We don't fully know what would have happened, in the mid-18th century Senegalese coastline there. The environment was unforgiving enough, so in any case, losses existed. But this was definitely a great British achievement. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Vorge, a seasoned veteran whose face bore the scars of campaigns in the War of Austrian Succession, was installed as the first British governor of Senegal. As a consequence, when the warehouses were thrown open, the whole astonished everyone. 1,200 enslaved Africans awaiting shipment, 300,000 pounds of gum arabic packed in tight bales, and ivory tusks valued at 40,000 pounds. When the ships finally dropped anchor at Spithead in July, they disgorged prizes worth more than 300,000 pounds in total, a spectacular windfall that lighted Pitt, vindicated his strategy, and silenced the chorus of parliamentary skeptics who had questioned the wisdom of diverting resources to African ventures. We've seen what was the political situation in Britain, the parliamentarian parties, and mostly, in fact, with a paradoxical immobilism from the side of the same mercantile investors towards the opportunities that would have otherwise opened with war that required naturally a great cost in the moment, but definitely with a 7 years war for Britain, the greatest of all powers, literally, in the world. Now, this virtually bloodless triumph only whetted British appetites for more. By August, Captain Augustus Keppel, who had only recently been escorting convoys in Irish waters, was detached from his duties and given orders to complete the reduction of French West Africa. His squadron, led by 74-gun HMS Torbay and accompanied by 3 nimble frigates, appeared off the coast of Gorée on December the 22nd. The island presented a far more formidable appearance than Saint-Louis, a star-shaped bastion equipped with 32 heavy cannon, garrisoned by 300 French infantry under the command of Chevalier de Rouly, and bolstered by 400 native militia. Keppel anchored at extreme range to avoid surprises and began a deliberate bombardment of the French emplacements on December the 27th, hurling red-hot shot that set the wooden barracks and storehouses ablaze. Imagine colonial Africa, as most places in the world at the time, everything made mostly in wood, very inflammable. By nightfall, flames were licking greedily at the powder magazine, by the way. At 10 o'clock the next morning, de Rouilly hauled down his flag in surrender. The entire operation had cost the British just 1 Marine killed and 4 sailors wounded, apparently, allegedly. With Goré's fall, France was effectively locked out of the lucrative Senegalese trade for the duration of the 7 Years' War. Governor Vorge wasted no time in extending British administration across the mainland from the Gambia River to the Petite Côte. Pitt, ever ambitious, began to contemplate even bolder penetrations, perhaps seizures of the forts along the Gold Coast or the slaving ports at Ouidah, but the Duke of Newcastle, perpetually haunted by the spectre of a French invasion of the British Isles, which was historically always a possibility, vetoed any further large-scale withdrawals of troops from home defenses. Nevertheless, a new formation known as the Africa Corps was raised under the command of Major Charles O'Hara to garrison the newly won territories, and before long, British slavers had established a near monopoly over the region's gum Arabic and human traffic. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean theater of operations had opened, where in the closing months of 1758, Major General Peregrine Hobson arrived at Barbados aboard a fleet of 23 transports that were escorted by Commodore John Hughes. His army totaled just over 6,000 men, 4,200 regulars drawn from the 38th, 61st, and 63rd Regiments of Foot. So these are naturally, in a colonial context, the toughest, also most expensive forces you must rely on anyway, and logistically more demanding, but in open field dominating. 1,100 kilted Highlanders of the famous 42nd Black Watch, and 800 Creole volunteers recruited in Jamaica. After revictualling with barrels of salted beef, sacks of Weebly biscuits, and casks of fiery rum, the expedition weighed anchor for Martinique on November the 12th. The island's capital, Fort Royal, lay nestled at the heap of a deep fjord-like bay that was flanked by towering morros and defended by twin shore batteries, each mounting 24 24-pounders. On November 16th, Colonel Jean Barret led 2,000 men ashore at Cas Navires, 3 miles south of the fort. The assault on the batteries was executed with great gallantry, but at a terrible cost. 112 killed and 143 wounded, among them Barret himself, who was decapitated by a cannonball that struck him squarely as he urged his men forward. With the batteries finally silenced, British scouts pushed inland only to find themselves confronted by impenetrable stands of mahogany forest and mangrove swamps that made the transport of artillery utterly impossible. Aboard HMS Winchester, Hobson convened a council of war. The unanimous opinion was that formal siege would demand 6,000 additional troops and a full siege train, resources that simply did not exist in the West Indies at the moment. By November the 22nd, the fleet had re-embarked and set sail for Saint-Pierre, Martinique's commercial hub. Reconnaissance conducted by Lieutenant Philip Orsbridge revealed that the French had entrenched 1,800 regulars behind stout redoubts and abattis supported by 3,000 militia. Orsbridge estimated that any assault would cost at least 1,500 British casualties, a price far too steep for an expedition already depleted by the earlier fighting. Martinique was thus reluctantly abandoned, and Hobson turned his attention to the neighboring island of Guadeloupe. The invasion of Guadeloupe began on January 22, 1759. Commodore Hughes' squadron subjected the principal town of Basseterre to a relentless bombardment until its stone warehouses blazed like furnaces, sending the stench of burning sugar and molasses drifting for miles across the water. The following day, 3,000 British troops landed unopposed on the beaches to the west of the town, but they soon discovered that the French governor, Nadeau de Trehan, had withdrawn his forces into the mountainous interior. There, his 1,200 regulars and 4,000 militia occupied a natural fortress known as Dosdan, a jagged ridge rising 1,200 feet above the surrounding countryside, accessible only by narrow goat paths and flanked by deep ravines and dense rainforest. The position was all but impregnable to direct assault, and de Terran calculated that malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery would decimate the invaders long before they could bring him to battle. His prediction proved grimly accurate. By the end of February, 1,100 British soldiers lay writhing in makeshift hospitals at Basseterre, their bodies racked by high fevers. 420 were already dead and buried in shallow graves dug in the sandy soil. On February the 27th, Hobson himself collapsed, his skin yellowed by jaundice, and he died within hours. Command passed to Brigadier General Henry Barrington, a cool-headed veteran of the raids on Rochefort and the siege of Louisbourg. Barrington's first priority was to secure the windward coast of the island. Commodore John Moore, who now commanded the naval squadron, sailed around Guadeloupe and on March the 1st subjected Fort Louis and, at Grande-Terre to a devastating bombardment. The fort's magazine exploded in a thunderous roar that killed 180 of its defenders. Moore then demanded 300 soldiers to replace sailors who had been lost to scurvy and fever. Barrington complied only to learn on March the 10th that a French squadron under Commodore de Beaufort had appeared on the horizon. Moore immediately weighed anchor and gave chase as far as Dominica, leaving Barrington with just 2,800 effectives, barely half of his original strength. The French now prepared a counter-offensive concentrating 3,500 men under Colonel de Clery for an attempt to retake Basseterre. Barrington, however, refused to be drawn into a purely defensive posture. Instead, he divided the enemy's attention by threatening landings at multiple points along the coast, and then, on March the 14th, he marched inland with 1,800 picked men. At Petitbourg, he surprised a detachment of 600 militia, routing them in a furious bayonet charge and capturing 20 field pieces in the process. On March the 19th, he stormed the town of Sainte-Anne, where the tricolor was hauled down after a 2-hour cannonade. Saint-Rose fell the very next day, its garrison fleeing into the mountains in disarray. By the dawn of April, only the western districts of Guadeloupe remained in French hands. Barrington advanced on Basse-Terre, the island's second city, but discovered that Étretat had breached the local dams in a desperate bid to flood the approaches and turned them into a quagmire. Undeterred, Barrington ordered his engineers to construct log causeways under constant musket fire. And at 3 o'clock in the morning of April the 12th, the 63rd Regiment of Foot scaled the walls in moonless darkness. By sunrise, the town was firmly in British hands. D'Étretat retreated to Cap-Terre with 1,200 survivors of his command, but on April the 20th, a relief force under Beauharnais arrived from Martinique, 600 fresh regulars and 2,000 buccaneers, only to discover that Barrington had already accepted the surrender of Cap-Terre the very previous day. Beauharnais re-embarked in disgust and sailed away. Guadeloupe was now British, though the victory had come at a staggering cost. 1,900 dead in combat and another 2,100 invalids who had to be shipped to hospitals in Antigua, the vast majority fell by disease rather than enemy fire. Undaunted by the butcher's bill, Pitt pressed on with his vision of totally eliminating French power in the Caribbean. In the spring of 1761, Parliament voted £1.2 million to fund a grand expedition under the command of Major General Robert Monckton. On June the 4th, Lord Rollo's 700 Highlanders landed at Roseau on the island of Dominica after a brief skirmish with 300 French militia. The island capitulated within hours. St. Lucia followed on June the 25th. Its garrison of 400 men surrendered to Commodore Sir James Douglas without a single shot being fired. Martinique, however, remained the ultimate prize. Monckton assembled a formidable force of 14,000 men, 17 regular battalions, 1,200 Highlanders, 800 American Rangers led by Major George Scott. If you're interested in this, guys, I made a video about not just like the Kentucky, Pennsylvania long rifle, and also, as we were saying before, the video on the French-Indian Wars in general, so like the general era, the wars of U.S. independence that somehow overlaps, at least with same people that fought during the 7 Years' War were, of course, fighting also later there. These guys were very good at skirmishing, sniping, essentially, at least sharpshooting. And 2,000 Jamaican volunteers on top of this force. The supporting fleet under Rear Admiral Rodney consisted of 20 ships of the line and 150 transports. This was a massive expedition. The invasion proper began on January the 16th, 1762, with landings at St. Anne Bay. For the next 12 days, British troops hacked their way through dense cane fields and rugged mountain passes, seizing key redoubts at Pigeon Islands and Mort Garnier after fierce fighting. On January 28th, siege batteries positioned on heights 800 feet above Fort Royal opened merciless fire, hurling 6,000 rounds into the fortress over the course of 5 days. The bombardment proved irresistible. The fortress surrendered on February the 3rd, and the remainder of the island followed suit by February the 15th. Monckton then detached Colonel Rufus Putnam with 1,200 men to accept the surrender of St. Vincent and Grenada, both of which yielded without any resistance whatsoever. With that, the entire chain of the Leeward Islands was now under British control. Spain's entry into the war through the Third Family Compact, signed on August 15, 1761, dramatically shifted the strategic priorities. Havana, often called the, quote, key to the Gulf, suddenly became the overriding objective. Lord Albemarle sailed from Spithead on March the 5th, 1762, with 4 regiments, the 1st, 22nd, 56th, and 72nd, totaling over 4,300 men embarked on 64 transports escorted by Admiral Sir George Pocock's squadron of 7 ships of the line. At Martinique, they linked up with Rodney's 8 additional ships and Monckton's over 8,400 battle-hardened veterans. From Jamaica, Sir James Douglas contributed 4 more line-of-battle ships and 600 enslaved pioneers who would serve as sappers. The resulting armada was awe-inspiring. 21 ships of the line, 24 frigates, and 168 transports carrying 14,000 sailors and 12,826 soldiers. To be precise, at least as far as we can document, this vast fleet threaded its way through the Old Bahama Channel, a passage that Spanish pilots had long insisted was utterly impossible for ships of such size. Havana came into view on June the 6th. Pocock immediately blockaded the harbor, trapping Admiral Hevia's squadron of 12 ships of the line inside. Albemarle landed 4,000 men east of Cojimar and quickly swept aside 2,000 Spanish militia who attempted to oppose the disembarkation. Naturally, you know what the broader alignment during the 7 Years' War was. Like the Bourbon ruled both in France and in Spain since the War of Spanish Succession. So of course, at this point, you see an attack to both French and Spanish colonial possessions in West Indies, and not only. By June the 8th, the British had encamped in a ring around the city itself. The key to Havana's defenses was Morro Castle, a powerful bastion fortress perched on the northern promontory, armed with 64 cannon and garrisoned by 700 men under the resolute captain Luis de Velasco. The castle was theoretically vulnerable because it was overlooked by the undefended hill known as La Cabaña, but the rocky terrain made conventional trenching all but impossible. Colonel Patrick McKellar, the chief engineer, overcame the difficulty by erecting breastworks of fascines and sandbags. I inserted also the picture among you. Here it's all documented in a broader sense, but some images are very specific. On June the 22nd, 12 32-pounders and 38 mortars opened fire from the heights of La Cabaña. Velasco's gunners replied with great spirit, dismounting an average of 4 British guns every day. At dawn, on June the 29th, 988 Spanish grenadiers, marines, and enslaved auxiliaries launched a daring raid on the batteries, spiking 11 cannon before they were finally driven off. On July the 1st, Pocock detached 4 of his ships, Stirling Castle, Dragon, Marlborough, and Cambridge, to bombard Morro from the seaward side. Because of the castle's elevated position, however, naval fire proved largely ineffective. Spanish counter-battery work killed 192 sailors and left the Marlborough crippled. A disastrous fire in the British lines on July the 2nd destroyed weeks of painstaking engineering work, but McKellar rebuilt the batteries using heavy guns taken from the ships. By July the 17th, only 2 Spanish cannon remained serviceable. Velasco, refusing every demand to surrender, launched a desperate sortie on July the 22nd with 1,300 men. The attack was repulsed with 400 Spanish casualties. On July the 29th, a mine detonated beneath the castle's right bastion, filling the ditch with rubble and creating a practicable breach. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon on July the 30th, 699 picked men, grenadiers drawn from the 42nd and 56th regiments, stormed the breach in a furious assault. Velasco, rallying his defenders at the head of the stairs, was mortally wounded by a musket ball that struck him in the chest. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Morro Castle was in British hands. The fall of the city itself was now only a matter of time. On August the 11th, 47 guns emplaced on La Cabaña pounded Havana without mercy. Fort La Punta was silenced by nightfall. Governor Juan de Prado, whose magazines held ammo for only 3 more days of resistance, capitulated on August the 13th. Admiral Hevia's fleet, 9 ships of the line, including the 70-gun Infanta and Reina, was captured intact. The prize money was staggering. Over £122,000 each for Albemarle and Pocock, over £24,500 for Augustus Keppel, and £1,600 for every captain. Just comparatively, these ciphers would have been respectively over 60 million, over 3 million, and over £210,000 nowadays, right? Which is staggering. On top of this, Havana's arsenals yielded stores valued at 1,800,000 pesos and more. This would have been something like 43 million pounds nowadays, along with merchandise worth another million pesos of the time. So again, an enormous amount of resources. British casualties totaled over 2,700 killed or wounded in combat and over 4,700 lost to disease by October. 5,000 graves dug in Cuban soil, which essentially, making the grim math of all this, would have brought to every life costing over £13,000. However, this whole enterprise and British success was much more lucrative for the British Empire, like in the rest of history. In the distant Philippines, meanwhile, Captain Samuel Cornish and Brigadier General William Draper sailed from Madras in August 1761 with 1,800 European and Sepoy troops. After a 13th-day siege, the walls of Manila, defended by 550 Spanish regulars and 8,000 Filipino militia, fell on October the 6th. Resistance continued in the hinterland for some time, but the capture of the city itself was a profound humiliation for Spain and a vivid demonstration of British naval supremacy in Asian waters. The Philippines, named after Philip II, were one of the earliest, most important Spanish overseas possessions. So, as you understand here, the British managed to make an enormous leverage on their naval forces to take over most unsatisfactorily defended Bourbon possessions overseas. As you understand also from the narrative here, every battle was bitterly fought. The British didn't have to win each one. But the fact that this pattern sort of obviously witnesses to a repetition of such success is also not really random. The British were developing, especially at this point, and through the insights, not just, of course, the political direction by Pitt, but the British military, especially the Royal Navy, as it had been historically developing, probably a clear strategic vision that allowed for the alignment, in fact, of the objectives of British government and the actual inactability of these military operations to seize otherwise sort of more stranded and dispersed outposts across the world that the French and the Spanish did, as we've seen, men in a consistent fashion, but not quite to resist the methodic, concentrated force of British quantity and quality, especially. So it's extraordinary. In other videos, we will look at each and every one of these battles because they deserve themselves also some more in-depth military historical analysis. And in all of this, you'd think that India, provides us with sort of more, like it was sort of overall, all these operations that we've seen also in the previous episode account for sort of a minimal importance considering the relevance that India would acquire in the British Empire. But the way the British affirmed their own hegemony over the subcontinent was not just, of course, say, gradual, but it started early on it was essentially secured simply by the defeat of the French presence. There were other Europeans in India at the time, by the way, and we'll at some point make more colonial history and warfare videos because that really deserves. In fact, one could argue that the Indian subcontinent was the war's most transformative theater, right? And that, in fact, the 7 Years' War is more, often really appreciated, in fact, for India than North America, for example, even though the consequences of the latter were arguably way bigger, right? Naturally, there is much about the 7 Years' War aftermath that also strategically, as you know, came to burden the British themselves, who had literally conquered too much. And so when you look at the U.S. War of Independence, you realize that it's part of this sort of overreach and or especially high costs for controlling these enormous territories. As we've seen also in the video about the French and Indian Wars at large, where, especially in North America, also relatively ridiculously manned. Like, we were talking very small amount of troops that, however, considering the important underdevelopment of those parts of the world, were enough to control through these European regulars plus militia and Indian support large swathes of the latter, because after all it was lording over a population rather than a territory just per se. There would have not been threats had these places been uninhabited at some actual parts of the globe at this point. Also, on Schwerpunkt we made multiple videos about Mughal warfare, and so you can argue that what unfolded in India during 7 Years' War can be traced against the backdrop of the Mughal Empire's terminal decline. We will not digress specifically into that, but some features of the same 7 Years' War development in the Indian subcontinent are pretty eloquent regarding also Western European superiority. So by the mid-18th century, the once mighty empire had become little more than a hollow shell. Right? Its richest province, Bengal, was governed by Nawab Alivardi Khan, who skillfully balanced the competing European trading companies while extracting tribute to keep his own coffers full. This is really typical. The Europeans had not fully invested to the conquest, probably of the hinterland. It was enough for them to dominate the seas, control the major ports, and therefore having this hinterland politics dependent on them. This was something that we see, even with Italians during the Middle Ages in the Mediterranean. It's the same identical dynamic, right? So it's Western European dominance over this, after all, pretty large and actually powerful, if you look at it in absolute terms, forces of locals that, however, get defeated in a broader sense, not just if you want social cultural, but in a truly political and military fashion, because war is asymmetric by definition. If it were just a matter of absolute force, whatever that is even supposed to mean in sociological, politicological terms, it wouldn't even be a war, technically, of any sort. Everything would be frozen, right? Now, upon Alivardi Khan's death, the throne passed to his grandson, Siraj-ud-Daula, who ascended at the age of 23, where in April 1756, the young Nawab combined youthful arrogance with a deep suspicion of British ambitions. He may have been, correct regarding the latter. When the East India Company began fortifying Calcutta, ostensibly as a precaution against French attack, but in clear violation of his explicit orders Siraj-ud-Daula's, he resolved to act decisively. It's interesting how these trade companies that would also evolve, in particular with the East India, into veritable states, right? In sort of they already were profiling like that, but were still basically in terms that the local strategic dimension was to be somehow still negotiated with the locals. So even the fortification of a British garrison that what was there, like this presence already existed, but was now entrenching more deeply, broke the pacts with his local powers, and this was the casus belli essentially that Siraj-ud-Daula used. As we've seen in the broader theater here, the point is concentrating very specific, sort of heavily concentrated force in. It's erroneous to call it specifically the Schwerpunkt, especially in a geographical sense. It can be sometimes also literally space, but not quite. I'm preparing some clarifying videos about all this. But it's mostly about exploiting, again, the very sort of strengths and weaknesses at the same time. Because the Schwerpunkt can be either of them. To allow your Schwerpunkt to have such a heavy specific weight not to be possibly assailable by another one across even this enormous country. After negotiations broke down, Siraj marched on the city of Calcutta with 50,000 men and 70 cannon. Our series about Mughal warfare stops to the mid-17th century. It's not like things are overwhelmingly changed, right? Actually, there were still some relatively traditional ways of war in India, even among the most developed policies. Calcutta's garrison, consisting of just 170 Europeans, 200 sepoys, that is from Urdu, properly Sipais, so these are Indian soldiers, and 50 volunteers, managed to hold out for 4 days before surrendering to some tens of thousands large force before surrendering on June the 20th. In the chaos that followed, 146 British prisoners were herded into the fort's tiny 18 by 14 foot guard room. When the door was opened at 6 o'clock the next morning, only 23 emerged alive. This is a terrible way to die, by the way. And it was so horrifying and shocking. News of this quote, black hole of Calcutta electrified the British presidency at Madras, in particular. On October the 16th, Robert Clive sailed from Madras with 900 European troops, 1,500 sepoys, and a naval squadron of 9 ships under Admiral Charles Watson. Calcutta was recaptured on January the 2nd, 1757. This tells you also, by the way, at large how sort of qualitatively scarce the larger forces of the Indian powers were. The nearby town of Hooghly was sacked on January the 9th. In a retaliatory force under Manik Chand was defeated on February the 4th. European firepower was a thing. It wasn't actually the primary factor in it, but tendentially, like in open field, line infantry firepower was incredibly useful. The subsequent Treaty of Alinagar restored the company's trading privileges in the area, but Clive's ambitions at that point extended far beyond mere restitution. His eyes were fixed on the French stronghold at Chandernagore. On March the 14th, he invested the fort. Naval guns breached the walls on March the 23rd, and the garrison surrendered. Notice the pattern here. Basically, there is an overwhelming naval firepower, a capacity to level the enemy defenses, some concentrated, disciplined force that managed to storm this destroyed place. So there is something indeed mostly about naval power that matters a lot here. And there is gradually this shift in strategic force across India that witnesses to the British taking, in fact, European avantpost after the French in this case, after the other, in parallel with the general difficulties that the French were experiencing in other fronts. As we've seen, actually in North America, that's where the French were more successful. And there can be many reasons for this. We've explained them in the first video, but in comparison, right, what you see here is much more far-sighted, something that the British, through, as you understand, a broader political vision, but also thanks to the men who were already in these countries and that knew, right? As we've seen, either the terrain or because they were either, I don't know, slave traders, or they were involved in trade companies in general. They had an eye for something that had never been pictured up to that point, right? Also because, again, the war in Europe now had broken out for so many different reasons. And sort of British development had been privileging naval forces. And so it's a series of circumstances that allow for the concretization of this strategy out of sheer will and broader vision. The elimination of French military power in Bengal emboldened Mir Jafar, who was Siraj-ud-Daula's commander-in-chief, to enter into a secret conspiracy with the company, even. The Battle of Plassey, in fact, fought on June the 23rd, famously enough, was less a conventional engagement, compared to what we have seen before in smaller clashes, than, in fact, a meticulously orchestrated coup. Clive's force of just over 3,000 men faced an army of 50,000, but Mir Jafar's contingent of 15,000 remained deliberately inert through the fighting. After a morning of long-range cannonade, a sudden monsoon downpour soaked the Nawab's artillery powder, while British ammo, carefully protected under tarpaulin, remained dry. So there is much about this battle. It's quite epic. In general, there is also this sort of curse that India carried with itself, saying Clive's death is a bit, dramatic in that sense. But in a bigger picture, you understand how, while there is an obvious European superiority, as always, we know also theologically that there can't be success without luck, right? And especially the greatest commanders are lucky. And in that sense, that there is a providential tip of the balance that helps further. And so Plassey crowns very much the sort of British strategic reward for merit and broader political intelligence, etc., during the 7 Years' War. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, in fact, Clive, on the Plassey battlefield, launched his assault. Just imagine it in this sort of very exotic environment, sultry weather, the massive, let's say, mysticism of these redcoats advancing, carrying that older sort of concept of Northwestern European power against this now more tonically swollen powers of the Indian subcontinent. By 5 o'clock, Siraj-ud-Daula had completely fled the field in panic, by the way. That's how much moral force is important. We know it well as Clausewitzians, but it's really a psychological clash here. It's something deeper than that. The Indian ruler was captured on July the 2nd and executed shortly thereafter by Miran, who was the son of Mir Jafar, by the way, so easily had this Indian feuds, allowing for her taking out inconvenient opponents just like that. In all this, the company installed Mir Jafar as a puppet Nawab, extracting £2.5 million in so-called compensation and the zamindari rights to the strategically vital 24 parganas. For sort of minimal technical language here, the zamindari would be some sort of administrative and revenue system, some sort of feudal mechanism in the Indian subcontinent, and as well as the class of landowners who operated within it. We've seen it actually in the video about the Mughal army were the zamindars among the ranks. The parganas instead, meaning district or portion, were foundational unit of rural administration in medieval and early modern India, particularly under, in fact, the Delhi Sultanate, Mughal Empire, and in fact the early British Raj that we are looking at fundamentally. And so that's basically how the same East India Company starts enfeoffing other Indian subjects, across the land. subsequent campaigns would only solidify British dominance. In 1758, the French briefly recaptured Fort William, but Colonel Ford retook it in April 1759, also annexed the northern Sircars in the process. Fort William was essentially the iconic British fort in Calcutta, now Kolkata, whereas the northern Sircars were essentially a vital coastal region in northeastern India. The plural stands for these various Sarkar districts or administrative units comprising, in fact, 5 administrative heads under the Deccan Suba province of the Mughal Empire. Right? It stretched 500 miles along the Bay of Bengal. They covered something like, 78,000 square kilometers in present-day northern Andhra Pradesh and southern Odisha. Right? And it was very important because it was very fertile, rice-rich lowland, part of the Coromandel coast, as very prized for trade ports. Look at, Visakhapatnam, Masulipatam. So a revenue fueling colonial ambition. So that the British at this point, I can't say here we're making a summary, of course, of what if you're aware, of course, of the India Company history. It's all very, it's a big thing. I'm about to start from the cycle / lottery, also modern contemporary history. So we're go slow. I don't know here. Many things are changing on Schwerpunkt, but it's important to cover all this in a broadly explicative fashion. This video was mostly just to stress the sort of the strategic side of the story, not even the narrowly military one, but still, it's a beginning, because we never really talked about this, and it seems unlikely for a channel like mine, like ours, as it's founded properly on military history. Now, a Dutch expedition dispatch from Java was crashed at Kinsura on November 25th, 1759. Indian history, it had been first colonized. The first colonizers of the Portuguese. Then the Dutch aggressively kind of settled in very specific hubs. And here, of course, in the broader entanglement of the 7 Years' War, bitterly fought also on the old continent battlefields, everything was that competitively changing. It was really understood, especially for someone like the Dutch that were more sort of outward projected through trade and finance and so on. And with a great history, of course, of clash against the British, at least now they had been mostly friends in the previous generations, but in the ones before, not quite. And in general, like the overseas competition between the British and the Dutch was also opening very had opened historically, and we'll make videos about that, quite intense naval confrontations between the two. Eric Hood's decisive victory at Wandawash on January 22nd, 1760, followed by the fall of Pondicherry on January 16, 1761, finally extinguished French power in India once for all. If you're interested, naturally, there is a specific detail about all these clashes, and that's why I was saying we will have to deal with them a bit more in depth. If you're interested, briefly, let's say, we are on the first, it's on November the 25th, 1759. This is a Dutch expedition of 700 European troops and 800 sepoys dispatched from Batavia, that is Java, quite a name, obviously, under Colonel Jean-Baptiste Roussel to aid the Nawab of Bengal against the British East India Company, landing near Kinsura on the Hooghly River. British Colonel Francis Ford, fresh from victories in the northern Sircars, as we've seen, intercepted them with a smaller force of 300 Europeans, 1,200 sepoys, and 100 artillerymen. And in the Battle of Kinsura, also called Bidera or Bedara, Ford's disciplined volleys and flanking maneuvers routed the Dutch in under an hour, capturing their ships and forcing surrender. This eliminated Dutch military influence in Bengal and secured British dominance in the region. 2 months later, on January 22nd, 1760, at Vandavazi in the Carnatic, British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Irkut decisively defeated the French army led by the Comte de Lailly. Could commanded 1,900 Europeans, 1,200 sepoys, and 1250 cavalry against Lailly's 2100 Europeans and 2,000 sepoys. Despite French cavalry charges, interestingly enough, Coutts' tactical use of terrain and superior artillery broke the enemy line, capturing Lailly's guns and scattering his troops. Lailly retreated to Pondicherry, losing over 500 men. This victory ended French hopes of recovering matters, crippling their field armies. We made lots of videos about Indian cavalry. We'll make against it. Imagine even the French bringing their own on this sort of flat grounds, and that's where, again, European tactics could also be not just confronting one another like here, but as we've seen also in other clashes, exposing the full might of their combined armed capacity against the sort of the medieval almost Indian armies. It's not, again, they weren't powerful. They had just to lose, just per se. It's just like the British were pretty darn good at what they were doing, and again, there were also mostly the other Europeans here, the French, the Dutch, in the air here to contend power from that. Those were really the most. Once you seized their own trade centers, you could simply expand it to the Indian countryside, hinterland, because you were just in any case having them depending on you, and this for things that were out of fact of control of the Indians. That yes could have a great force in the continent, subcontinent, but not really coping with the navy, the dynamic that could thus be enforced on them. Finally, after a 9-month siege beginning in April 1760, Pondicherry, France's last major stronghold in India, surrendered on January 16th, 1761. Coutts' 8,000-strong army, supported by Admiral Charles Stevens' naval blockade, cut off supplies. It's very typical. Starvation at that point and disease reduced the garrison from 1,700 Europeans and 2,000 sepoys to fewer than 600 effectives. Lailly capitulated. So again, the same pattern. British naval superiority, blockaded port, so the settlement can't be resupplied. It basically is overwhelmed by bombardments and then the assaults. The fortress was razed, by the way. I also inserted a picture here showing you properly the ruin, the stones left. With Pondicherry's fall, French territorial power in India was effectively extinguished, leaving the British East India Company unchallenged on the subcontinent. And this is actually the bottom line here. When you look at the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, and again in this series we mostly looked at what the British did from mostly their own perspective. Like also in the previous video we've seen a bit more about the French, because it was also a bit more not immediately successful British venture, so to say, North America. Also in Mallorca, as we've seen, things were not just easy. All right, so here, these other theaters of the war around the globe seem much smoother for the British. And so here we look at the aftermath of, in general, the 7 Years' War, per se. We'll surely talk more about it. You have the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, confirming the full extent of these British conquests. Britain retained Canada, the Ohio Valley, Florida, the Florida of the Spanish, in effective control over Bengal, right, on the Indian Ocean. And in a gesture of calculated magnanimity, Britain came to essentially restore Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Gorée to the French, as well as the Philippines to their former Spanish owners. This was decided in a broader sort of political sense for reasons that had a lot to do with the general balance of the situation. I mean, if you get North America and India, it's okay. Largely, like you don't, even the Caribbeans and Southeast Asia is not even so important in the bigger picture, and you don't want to pressingly humiliate such a powerful country like France that, yes, has really, performed very poorly during the 7 Years' War, unlike in other wars for that matter. And there is always this sort of back and forth. The British had really been soundly beaten at Fontenoy. That was the heyday of the French. Then you have the 7 Years' War, that is the downfall, then rise again at the time of the U.S. War of Independence and beyond. So These things we've seen also doctrinally happening with great effort, with great broader political and strategical issues. French trading factories in India were also permitted to remain. However, they were stripped of all military capability. So in other words, you had, again, these other Europeans in India that, however, were absorbed by the British trade system, right? They had to essentially to export mostly through now British-controlled coastline ports. And as such, yeah, they could be there. There were some other European colonists that helped the development out there, but they were demilitarized. They were neutralized in a strategic sense, and just contributing at that point a bit also to French wealth, but mainly to the British one in a broader picture. National, international. Spain regained Havana and Manila, as we described, even after, again, the great British effort, especially in the former siege, 1762. But the Spanish Empire was forced to cede Florida in exchange. As for to the mainland territories around Senegal, those became the British colony of Senegambia, France prioritizing the immense profits of its sugar islands over the frozen expanses of New France. Also effectively abandoned North America to British dominion, as we know. So that was a painful resolution, also considering the sound French capabilities displayed there, much more than elsewhere. And then the British had initially taken a beating. The war had been fought across 4 continents and 3 oceans, earning it the enduring sobriquet of the First World War, even though, that's debatable. It also, who cares? When the smoke finally cleared, Britain stood unchallenged as the preeminent colonial and naval power on Earth, literally, right? Its vast empire's foundations laid in the blood, treasures, and audacious gambles of the years of 1756, 1763. We'll surely talk more about the 7 Years' War, also at a continental level, because there is a lot of history there, to say the least, from a military point of view, and not only. We, however, here we're focusing specifically on British history, because we actually made a fair amount of even modern British warfare content. That's something you want to appreciate from this channel, because it's not like we intentionally started covering literally, especially the later modern period like this one, and talking about especially the fundamentals, like talking about, here I see 22 videos, this is the 23rd, right? We started a bit with English Civil War back in the day, then we went also a bit through the Tudor era, the Armada before. Actually, we also made a series we still have to finish, but we managed to talk a little bit more about the British military reforms post-Fontenoy. It's all something you find in the top 6 comment down below. We randomly talk about the Battle of Bergen last spring, for example. We recently started a mini-series about Marlborough, as a matter of fact, and these are all intros, right? I would obviously not. We also talk about Canadian warfare, that at this point also becomes sort of British matter in particular. So there is so much to cover, and my dream, as you know, is covering the entirety of probably the annals of military history, gradually, step by step, with some sort of bit of difficulty, because I realized that this modern warfare, for example, I made that video about Marlborough, I was just seeing it before, and my eye fell on the views of the same. Here I can see 539 views, like it's very few, right? I understand that I didn't specifically focus the channel's attention on British history, but at the same time, I think it's very, very important that we blend European history as a whole. Like, people I discovered, of course, over the years, and very predictably, that they tend to have, we all have, of course, specific national favoritisms and or sort of the need to talk first and foremost about certain countries or others for different reasons. It can be very complex at a time. It's not simply where you come from or stuff like that. It's always tied into it, but the reasons, the opinions, the views, the perspectives are very variegated, really. And the point is that you can't, this is also the leitmotif of the channel, you can't really understand either part of Europe or the world if you don't have a cohesive view of the whole. And this is very difficult to get. I mean, on Schwerpunkt, we're really showing how this is supposedly done, because I'm literally doing this 2,600 videos largely talking about this stuff, and it feels like there isn't even like a full sort of fully compact glue keeping everything together. Nevertheless, I think that the more we talk about modern British warfare, say, more people will come watch this stuff. And here we see naturally even scarce amount of views for modern British warfare. I don't know how or why, but we should investigate to some extent. It's a pity because sort of it is also very interesting in general. Like, I've always been interested in that. I had the opportunity of studying at university, like for a particular class, probably the British 17th century at large, like the entire period. And it's something illuminating. In fact, it may be my favorite period of British history, but we really have to do more about the 18th, the 19th century because of obvious reasons. The British Empire, that is properly at least born in its, it was born before, so to say, but in its primacy, in its superiority, in it being the greatest power on the globe at that point. Here, in the 7 Years' War, you can argue that Plassey made it, right? It wasn't in North America, it wasn't even the sum of all this at large, was eventually this critical mass of power deriving from the Indian subcontinent conquest that really brought the British really to dominate, if anything, especially the seas at large. So to say, there was always, Britain in the sense was the greatest power in the world at the time, but it was still sort of chased, especially by France, right? So it's not like a broad ecumenic empire of some sort. But there is something global in nature still, and some, in fact, universal meaning also to the rise of the British Empire. I think it would be always very important to investigate on Schwerpunkt, understanding what went traditionally right for a country like Britain, regardless of, say, the Protestant Church, and what had brought, even as a fact, part of a breaking free from other constrictions, like this sort of British power that was high for, again, a consistent century and a half, fundamentally, in the way we mostly imagine the greatness of it. And that, however, also would be, was today especially, is somehow forgotten. And by the same British, in the way that, of course, we see brought to an endless amount of problems to themselves that I think can be properly dispelled if, right, we have the courage of looking at this history. And in fact, like even from the views, if you're not interested in modern British warfare, you're actually actively damaging Western civilization. And so it's not a matter of sympathy or niche or whatever, some strategic choice. It is really about Europe in its entirety. And of course, I know that there's just lots of British followers that surely, I don't know, Brexited, so to say, at least through their own active participation, so they have all their own ideas and worldview of it and so on. Unfortunately, however, this is a kind of disorientation that strikes exactly in an anti-traditional way. Most people that today are trying to presume that they are fighting for tradition, they're actually anti-traditional. They don't understand that because they're told that there is just one flat, basic, univocal way to do things, and that just turns out to be a post-traditional product, and you have to fly a bit higher to understand that tradition is something that goes far beyond what you believe as a glimpse of the concept can be. I mean, is it really in your view? And so it's a collective effort. You can't really do this alone. And that's why I think that Britain, as probably not just an obviously European country, but I mean probably European in a broader continental sense, which is not an oxymoron, because still, it's not a matter of you can be part of a continent also by being on an island, for that matter. And that's what I care about the most. And I must say that in my British history videos, I maintain always a pretty high sense of, not just, it's a property of admiration, not even just of respect of some sort of, I don't know, vaguely antagonistic. No, that my point, I've been naturally very vocal at some point in history, of our history of Schwerpunkt, concerning the issues deriving from at least the worst aspects that unfortunately in every part of the world, in every culture, are manifesting now. And since the Anglo-Saxon one is the dominant one, because of also the topic that we have discussed today as a cause, it's also more far-reaching. And so unavoidably you end up criticizing certain aspects of the same, for how they manifested in a system that otherwise could give much more, simply by its own constitutive nature that is very unique. And I must say, the more I study that, the more fascinated with I am. Right, I never really talked about this, but I had an early connection with Britain in my life, and that still lives to this day, for as far as those aspects for which were concerned. But in my sort of my adulthood and in my studies, I never really had much of the luck, the privilege, etc., to just browse this further to the way I think it really deserves. For example, British tradition, also the British Catholic tradition, something I investigated here and there, but there is a richness and a depth of culture that especially some detractors like to say, also for the Americans, like say, I don't know, these are sort of younger people, so they do not own. And that's absolutely not true, right? There is an incredibly important approach, and also a primarily unspoiled to some extent. It is a bit how the British live their life, or at least they conceptualize it as in very aesthetic terms, and very as a work of art. There is some definitively charming sort of charmingly ideal in British culture and identity that is exactly what has been taken away. And this is a product of ignorance. This is not a product, again, of something that is wrong with that culture. It's something that, well, maybe, again, through the paths of modernization and secularization were very pronounced in countries like Britain, kind of, so it explains it. But it's not because the mold was defective. And so I would like, again, to explore, and that's why I'm likely going to make more videos about British. I see here British warfare at large. This is the 84th video. But it's still too unspecific, and again, I think we really need way more than this. Nevertheless, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.